We now live in a world in which Ukraine has invaded Russia, and in a world in which Ukraine, as of the time of this writing, is occupying a slice of Russian territory, roughly the size of New York City. We still don't know the significance of Ukraine's incursion into the Kursk Oblast, but it marks the first time that foreign troops have occupied Russian territory since the World War II. 150,000 people have been evacuated. So in order to discuss the significance of this and the effects it might have on the Russian regime and Putin's power specifically, I have invited Vladimir Milov, who is a Russian politician and economist and has served as Russian Deputy Minister of Energy in 2002. And since then, he has been part of various think tanks, as well as working for the Alexei Navalny presidential campaign in 2016. He also today runs a YouTube channel where he regularly provides updates on the situation in Russia. He can no longer live in Russia, but works from Lithuania. But before saying welcome to Milov, I would just like to extend my sympathy to the citizens of Poltava and Ukraine and the relatives of the civilians killed in the horrendous bombing of Poltava today. But this might, we'll also have the opportunity to discuss. So I'd like to welcome you, Vladimir Milov, and maybe you could explain a bit on how you see the significance of the incursion of the Ukraine troops into Kursk.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, Charlotte, and hello, everyone. I join you sincerely in condolences to the relatives of the victims of another Russian barbaric bombing of civilian targets, this time in Poltava, but it happens across Ukraine, and the Free Russians are with Ukrainians and fully support their fight for their freedom, their sovereignty, and their lives against unprovoked Russian aggression. Speaking of the Ukrainian Kursk offensive, I think this has several very important consequences. First, and I think this is a result of the past 4 weeks, we are into 1 month of Ukrainian military presence in the region of Kursk. And I think one important issue that this has exposed is Putin's significant lack of military personnel to actually contain the situation on different geographical parts of the front line, because he has been concentrating his most combat-able forces in the areas where Russia is currently undergoing some active offensive operations, primarily in Donbass, around Pokrovsk direction, and some others. But what we do see is that in 4 weeks, and that is a remarkable thing in itself, in 4 weeks' time, Putin did not actually find and was able to amass a significant force to respond to a Ukrainian incursion in Kursk. The way they have actually, Ukrainians have taken control of a really very significant, over 1,000 square kilometers of Russian territory in just a matter of days, really exposes one of the Putin's major weaknesses in this war, his lack of manpower. This is actually a very important factor in itself. And this is something contradictory to what many analysts in the West have been saying, because there's this presumption that Putin has unlimited manpower, that Russia has 140 plus million population, so that he can always draft some people if he needs more men to fight in Ukraine. This is actually not true. Even if you look at the Russian statistics, men aged from 20 to 40 years old are only 20 million people. That's definitely not 140. And if you do, you mentioned my YouTube channel. I recently did a video in Russian, but we will translate it somehow because I see that this topic is highly in demand. I did a breakdown because, significant part of this male population aged from 20 to 40 is already engaged either in the military or security services or military production industries, about from a quarter to a third of those men. The other problem is that About a third of them, according to various estimates, are physically, medically unfit for military service, for different problems. Particularly one of the issues that Ministry of Defense have been complaining about pre-war is problems with eyesight of new draftees. So that's the huge issue for the Russian population. The health of the population is not as good. According to Ministry of Defense, only at the end of last year, about 1 million people received an official waiver from drafting because they are being employed in strategically important sectors of the economy, which in turn suffers from really bad shortage of skilled labor. If you listen to any economic officials or business community, they would name this as a problem number one, a looming problem for the Russian economy, extreme deficit of skilled labor, which have been broken any records in the past few months, obviously because of the war, mobilization, and people massively fleeing the country because of all that. So on the background of this, we see that there's this huge manpower challenge which Putin was not able to solve. There's been a lot of speculations that he might call for another round of mandatory mobilization, but then again, putting aside Russian public opinion, which is extremely negative towards the next wave of mobilization, about 2/3 of Russians firmly reject it and do not want to participate. But that thing aside, another important issue is that if you listen to anything that's being said in the economic, financial, and business world, they are literally mentioning the potential new round of mass mobilization as nothing short of a catastrophe for labor market, for economy, for GDP growth, and so on. Which is why you see that in 2 years' time, since September 2022, exactly 2 years ago, Putin have called for the first round of mandatory mobilization, but 2 years since, he didn't opt for a second round, despite the fact that he badly needs all these people at the battlefield, but he's hesitating for very simple reasons that I just outlined. Extreme trouble for the economy and labor market, and negative public opinion, and so on. Even if he calls theoretically this mobilization now, will take months and months to train these people, so they will not be able to fight, probably before the new year. Again, which means that Ukrainian military presence in Kursk is here to stay. So I would say, to me, this is a major factor that is important, and that the Ukrainian Kursk offensive had highlighted, because we can talk a lot about this, geographical situation at the front line. But the thing is that what we have seen in the past few months, that here is one of the major Putin's vulnerabilities. He does not have a major manpower to fight across this lengthy front line. He has only but a number of real combat ready troops that he currently uses in the some of the limited offensive areas, but largely that's it. This pretty much tells you a lot about potential future disposition in this war. Whereas I have to say that the same problem exists on the Ukrainian side, and they also don't have unlimited manpower either, and Ukraine has significant challenges with the ability of the country to mobilize more people to fight for the front. However, speaking of Putin's potential for offensive operations, you see that really that takes a lot more people than he currently possesses. That is actually good news. The Kursk operation had exposed, because Putin tried to present, the facade like he has this unlimited number of troops, but Kursk operation of Ukrainian army has actually exposed his major weakness. He doesn't have much more people for particularly extremely brutal human wave attacks. That continues to be the main Russian offensive tactics, which means that these human waves attacks are extremely costly in terms of battlefield losses per square kilometer of advance. If he continues that way, that means that his manpower potential will be expired pretty soon. So if you look across the board at different vulnerabilities, Russian military production has been significantly slowing down in June and July, particularly with regard to battlefield vehicles, battle tanks, other armored vehicles, airplanes, and so on. That is also because of the effectiveness of Western sanctions and the lack of the ability to import significant equipment and machinery needed to build new production lines, and lack of necessary components and technologies which neither Russia nor China possess. In July, the production of battlefield vehicles had slowed down to just 5% year-on-year growth, basically flattening out as compared to like 40-50% annualized growth in the previous months. So we see that there's clearly a major limitation there. The CEO of Rostec, one of the biggest actual Russian arms producer, Sergei Chemezov, one of the closest Putin's cronies, several months ago said in an interview to RBC that Russian military manufacturing industries are running at near zero profitability. So there's not enough money and very high expenses, also because of the sanctions. And he literally said that industries cannot run like that for much longer. We also see multiple other challenges, like the army supply system is nearly broken. Soldiers are buying, like major officials have been admitting that soldiers have to spend about half of their salary buying some necessary stuff like equipment or some medical stuff and food for themselves. They're not being given that by the army. The other thing is that Russian government has to continuously index the payments for military servicemen because of both raging inflation that beats all the expectations, and also the fact that nobody's really eager to get drafted and lose their lives in Ukraine, which is actually why government has to significantly raise the price tag. In areas like Moscow, it's currently 2,300,000 rubles one-time pay for a contract with Ministry of Defense. It was just 200,000-300,000 rubles 2 years ago. So 10 times growth of a price tag for signing a contract to fight in Ukraine in just a couple of years. So you see that the problems are mounting. Coming back to introductory remarks and wishful thinking, this is not to say that Putin's resources are going to end tomorrow. He still has certain ability to fight. But we see on all fronts, manpower, military industries, money, ability to pay salaries to military servicemen. We see that the corridor is narrowing, which is actually coming back to what happened in Poltava and other barbaric Russian bombardments of Ukrainian cities, resorting to the tactic of terror and terrorizing Ukrainian civilian population is one of the signs that Moscow is kind of desperate. Again, we're not there yet. Putin still possesses significant resources to continue the war, but there are also signs of desperation. Moscow sees that it needs to use these terror methods to break the spirit of Ukrainians and their will to resist, because the resources are finite. Resources on many fronts are running low. I think we should see and treat all this information and figures as encouraging, however difficult this might be in the current circumstances, but encouraging signs. Putin is not invincible. His resources are still available, but shrinking. That means we need to double down on determination to help Ukraine, help them resist militarily, increase the effectiveness of Western sanctions against Putin's regime. And there is a light at the end of this tunnel. And clearly we see, again, as the consequence of the Kursk operation of the Ukrainian military forces, we see that there are major Putin's weaknesses that are being exposed. He's not able to conduct offensive operations across the whole front, save for some narrow sections and so on. That means Putin's potential to actually win this war is limited at best, if any. And that is an encouraging thought. And this is what also been exposed in the past months by Ukrainian Kursk offensive. However, there's a long road from here to Ukrainian victory, but there is a way. And once there is a will, there is a way. So I think this signs of certain Putin's weaknesses should encourage determination in helping Ukraine resist and potentially win this war.
Thank you, Milov. But I'd just like to return a bit more to the question, and it's also about, the reaction of the Russian population to the incursion. So how are they reacting, and does it matter at all when you have 150,000 people fleeing their territory and there's no likelihood that they can actually return home for a while? How does that affect anything, and does it matter?
That's a very important question, because definitely in totalitarian states which exert brutal daily control over behavior of their citizens through extreme repressions, yes, it's true that the public opinion and societal behavior matters far less. What is a new development in the Russian society in the past 3 or 4 years, it started even before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, is that a significant number of Russians have received lengthy prison terms for simply expressing a disagreement with government policies. Again, that started with the arrest of Alexei Navalny and some of the prominent opposition activists as far as in 2021, before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But what happened later? We now have over 1,000 of political prisoners as per Memorial and other Russian NGOs, probably significantly more, because NGOs, they have a very strict criteria for defining people as political prisoners. But what you do see are some ordinary folks who are never involved in major political activity or resistance movement. They just reposted some comments or social media, or pulled out some air balloons into the air of the colors that the Russian government doesn't like. Or they donated $50 to Ukrainian NGOs helping people who are suffering from Russian military aggression and so on. You hear prison terms of 12, 25 years. That's something we haven't seen in decades. As a matter of fact, this level of outreach of repressions to many ordinary citizens and households, we haven't really seen that since 1950s. The late Soviet years under Brezhnev, Andropov, and Gorbachev, we only had like 200-300 dissidents imprisoned, but not that massive scale of repressions against ordinary population. So this is why no question that society is scared, which means that its ability to react is very much depressed. People are scared to stick their heads out because they will be squashed by the repressive machine. On the other hand, many signs, like if you carefully listen to what is being said on television, on different gatherings, fora, and so on, people are really speaking about somehow ending this war. According to opinion pollsters, like recent Levada Center figures, that would give you some idea of like a healthy majority of people who would end the war the sooner the better, versus those who wish to continue fighting. The people who say that they want the war to continue are within 35-40% of the society maximum. Well, over 50%, a clear majority wants peace talks and want this war to end. So the fatigue is significant, which also results in Putin's limited ability to draft more people to fight, because this potential is largely exhausted, which yet again, I come back to the factor of government being forced to significantly raise the price tag for people being drafted for the war. So again, no sensations here. Society is very afraid, is very adaptive, prefers not to challenge the repressive machine. But on the other hand, it's also not eager to help Putin continue wage this war. There was a very emotional and pretty desperate address by this guy, one of the prominent figures of Putin's entourage, Dmitry Rogozin, who occupied different government positions. Now he's in the Federation Council. Last week, he recorded a pretty desperate video address saying that we need people for the front, for military industries. We need your help. We're not getting enough. So please contribute. Don't sit or we're going to lose. Many prominent figures that have been supporting Putin's invasion, public speakers, they've been literally speaking openly recently about the possibility of Russia losing this war. So something is changing in the air. So all this fatigue plus resource depletion that we talked about earlier, somehow it's taken a toll and the society feels it, and you can see signs here and there across the place.
So it's the first cat in our YouTube, but I like it.
Yeah, that's the owner of the studio. Actually, I'm a guest here.
Yeah, no, that's really nice. But I just to follow up on what you're saying, there's also this guy who calls himself Prigozhin #2, Sakrepsky, who's actually calling for an official or sort of a palace coup against Putin. Has that any significance, or is he, is there a master behind him, or how does he dare to say these things?
No, I think it's more of a sign of a desperation because, listen, many people talk like that. Many people talk like that. If you, we have a renowned Russian-American journalist, Michael Naki, who also runs his very popular anti-war, anti-Putin YouTube channel with nearly 2 million subscribers. What he does is he frequently browses through what we call the so-called Z community. You know that Z symbol has been one of the symbols of Putin's military aggression against Ukraine. So there's this relatively narrow segment of ultra-patriotic community which has a totally twisted vision of Russian patriotism, basically attacking and annihilating other nations and countries. So they really desperate. They weeping daily that everything goes wrong. Russian military cannot really handle its job at the battlefield and so on. So that's a very widespread critique. The difference of Prigozhin was that he also, and this is actually why he was sticking his head out too much and became so outspoken. Prigozhin was one of the few exceptions in the Putin system because he also controlled his own media and social media empire. He had a number of media outlets promoting him, social media trolls promoting him. I think this is what wielded Prigozhin's belief that, he's that all-powerful person who can challenge the top leadership of the Russian military and so on, because he was the only guy who was allowed to run his own sort of semi-independent media empire. I think Putin now realizes that this was a mistake. He killed Prigozhin, obviously crashed his Wagner mercenary group, his media empire, and so on. I think Russian government would not allow anybody to wield as much public influence as Prigozhin had. They learned from this mistake. So whatever this guy said, we had another one named Girkin Strelkov, who was one of the pioneers of Russia's incursion and occupation parts of Donbass back in 2014, more than 10 years ago. Strelkov is now in jail for criticizing Russian military leadership too much. I think that guy might as well follow suit. What is important here are not some specific comments by some of these people. What is important that the specific feature of this year is that a lot of this sharp criticism from across the board are breaking out in the open. Problems are mounting. We see the signs and indications both in official statistics and in comments from this aggressive chauvinistic part of the society, like you just mentioned, and so on. So that is an indication of mounting problems, and to me, it looks like a good thing.
Recently, a large number of generals and deputy defense ministers, close to Shoigu, among others, the former Minister of Defense and the current head of the Security Council, has been indicted and charged on corruption charges. So you have a sort of a purge in the military. And this is in the middle of one of the biggest, you could say, military operations of Russia ever since the Second World War. How do you see this, these purges, these charges on corruption, which probably exist, but what is taking place, and how is that sustainable in this situation?
These are not the first arrests. If you really look back like a couple of years from now, in retrospect, what you would see, and it's actually very easy to find this news in Russian if you search for Russian Google News, regional news, or whatever. There's been, in the recent couple of years, there's been an array of arrests and detentions and even long-term prison sentences for the leadership of military manufacturing enterprises, which clearly did not deliver weapons of necessary quality and quantity as Putin wanted. Did this do anything to actually improve the performance of a Russian military manufacturing complex? Clearly not. So this is again what you see these arrests in the Ministry of Defense right now. These are issues that the steps that are taken out of desperation again. So they're cleaning up the ministry of the most exposed former affiliates of ex-defense minister Shoigu, but they're replacing them with new ones with pretty murky background. New deputy defense minister Anna Civilova, who is a relative grandniece of Putin, She was known for being a wife of an ex-governor of Kemerovo, a major coal-producing region, now Russia's new energy minister. They were extremely corrupt. They stolen nearly everything in the region that they governed for a significant number of years. The other guy, who is the right hand of new defense minister Belousov right now, Leonid Gornin, he was for 12 years a major deputy minister of finance who was actually signing the allocations of money for all that, corrupt contracts and stolen money by Shoigu's clan. So he was effectively a part of that entourage. His signature, his visa is there on all the corrupt deals and so on. Now he's supposed to be a new guy who cleans up corruption in the Ministry of Defense. So this is what we call, in Russian, we have this word "kompaneyshchina," which is like, I would say, a window dressing campaign in its worst sense. So some, showcase arrests that are, aimed at demonstrating that we're going against corruption, but the system remains the same. It's extremely non-transparent. It's not subject to any forms of civilian control. Not even the government-controlled NGOs are allowed to look into these military spending books. It's top secret. Russia now has extremely classified military budget. I would say over 80% of military spending is classified right now. How are you supposed to fight corruption in that kind of environment, particularly if you use the old corrupt guard and what is supposed to be cleaning up this mess? So no, I do not attach any excessive significance to all these recent arrests. They have to do something because corruption is extreme. But they're not fighting the root problem. They're not introducing the transparency and mechanisms of control. They're just replacing some of the old corrupt guys with the new corrupt guys, which will not help, and which is good news for Ukraine and the free world. So corruption will continue to persist, basically slowing down Russia's military capabilities.
And now to something a bit different. I'd like to hear your opinion on the prisoner swap. The swap of Kara-Murza and the negotiations behind it, and how do you see it? Was it what was it a sign of? Why did Putin's regime actually accept this swap? And how do you see? Was it a win for Putin, or was it, what was the significance of this?
For Putin, I think this was like in very practical terms, that was a win-win situation, because Putin basically retrieved a lot of his spies and murderers that he sought after for quite a long time. So that was like a, package deal. He got nearly everybody he wanted. But generally, I have to say, I was hearing from Western sources even like half a year ago, at the end of winter, early spring, that a Russian government is issuing a very negative signals when being asked about the possibility of releasing some of the Russian political prisoners, like Ilya Yashin, Vladimir Karamurza, Lilia Chanisheva, and others. They have been for years, they have been issuing a clear no signal, like this is never going to happen. We might discuss releasing and swapping some of the Western nationals held in detention in Russia, but not the Russian nationals, not the Russian political prisoners. So you see that something has clearly changed in the past few months. If you look at what happened to Putin's rhetoric since approximately May this year, Putin began to mention potential peace talks and some sort of a ceasefire agreement and settlement with Ukraine, something he never mentioned before. Because in the previous years, consecutively, he's been saying that we are continuing until we fulfill the goals of the so-called special military operation, how they call it, an aggression against Ukraine, with actually no references to potential peace negotiations, settlements, ceasefire, whatever. That rhetoric has sort of, being pushed aside recently because of Ukrainian offensive in Kursk. But generally, again, in the past few months, we heard from Putin himself and some top Russian officials that Russia might be ready for peace talks. That was also a big departure from all the previous rhetoric. If you put that into one basket with the prisoner exchange, which did indeed happen, that means basically that something is shifting in Moscow. They are most likely seeing the finite nature of their resources, the depletion of resources on various fronts, as we just discussed. By the way, one of my favorite ways of entertaining my viewers is that I compile a pretty gloomy public statements by different Russian officials on different issues, the economy, the status of the military and military manufacturing industries. There is a significant realization within the Russian circles of power that they do not have the ability to perpetually wage an endless war. They don't have the resources for that. So they might be interested in developing some channels of talking to the West, talking to Ukraine about how to end this whole thing. Again, we're not there yet. But with the prisoner swap and with Putin's recent rhetoric about potential peace talks, you probably saw that some mindset in Moscow is also shifting, which is, again, not to be taken as a face value. Putin is definitely not a person to be trusted, but this is a sign of shifting mentality on the background of depletion of resources. And that should also be taken by the free world as somewhat an encouraging sign.
But wouldn't you say that Putin's strategy for political survival is actually war? That he would actually lose his power if he gave up the
Putin is an experienced survivor. He's been in power really 25 years. In August 99, Boris Yeltsin had de facto granted Putin the already effectively presidential powers. So he's been in power for 25 years through very different situations. And, Putin will try to do whatever to maneuver, to make sure that his power is not challenged and so on. And, in this regard, he's quite a skillful person. We need not to underestimate himself. What is necessary is not to get distracted, by his maneuvering, but to continue systemically deprive this system of resources. Continue to inflict damage to Putin's military at the battlefield, and obviously providing more military assistance to Ukraine and lift some unnecessary restrictions on Ukraine's ability to respond to Putin's aggression and offensive tactics. We need to enhance the effectiveness of sanctions because they do work, and a lot of sanctions are bringing Putin's economy down in many aspects and so on. We also need to continue, and this is what the Russian opposition in exile is actively doing. We have a multi-million audience inside the country that we reach through with the help of the social media. We're trying to influence public opinion and change it. And we have, I would say, some temporary successes here because we have managed to help explain to the Russians that continuing the war is much worse option than ending it, that Russians are generally very negative and hostile to the idea of a second round of mobilization and so on. So Putin really has big problems with mobilizing support for the war back home. You see that actually there are really no people lining up. Again, for the first time in 80 years, some of the Russian internationally recognized territory has been controlled by a foreign army. What was expected, if there was only such an upheaval of a patriotic sentiment as many Western commentators are talking about it, people would be lining up to defend the Russian soil from a foreign army. There's nothing of that sort that is happening. On the other hand, what you see is a very charming debate because all this, ultra-patriotic community on social media is actually blaming the residents of Kursk region, saying, why are you fleeing big numbers? You are able, full-bodied men who can stand up and fight against Ukrainian army. And these people who flee Kursk, they say, why don't you stay up from the sofa and go fight yourselves, instead of writing comfortable posts on social media. But as a result, nobody's going. Neither one segment or the other. So that really reflects that Russian society is not really ready to get engaged in this perpetual fight, which means that we need to continue to apply all these forms of pressure to further weaken Putin and his system, regardless of his maneuvering. We can clearly see now the finite nature of his resources and ability. That should encourage us to push further.
Should we also prepare for the day after Putin? There's a lot of people saying, if Putin falls, somebody worse will come to power. How do you see the way that we can prepare for sort of a transition of power in that day, or how can we support that in the best possible way?
Several things. First, there's this widespread notion that whatever comes after Putin might be even worse. Frankly speaking, I don't know where does this come from. There is no evidence on the ground whatsoever to support that notion. First, I would refer, again, this is not me. And my specific feature is that in my coverage of Russia and Russian events, I always use the official numbers of the quotes by officials. So this is the most official you can get. The chairman of ЦИОМ, the most pro-Kremlin opinion polling agency, Valery Fedorov, who also happens to be officially an advisor to the deputy head of the Kremlin administration. He has given an interview a year ago to RBC media outlet where he literally said that this active pro-war party in Russia, which wants to continue perpetual aggression against Ukraine, the West, and other neighboring countries, is no more than 10–15% of the population. This relatively thin layer of Russian society, you see that it has huge potential. It's supposed to have huge potential to mobilize the rest of the country to fight, but in reality, it doesn't happen. As I just said, they're involved in wrangling about who defends the areas of Kursk region that are now controlled by Ukraine, and nobody counts, right? So the ability of these people to mobilize the rest of this country to fight is actually very much overestimated. Most of the country wants calmer waters, does not want war. That's pretty clear. Any polling would tell you. So and again, we saw many historical examples. What happened after the death of Stalin, after the death of Brezhnev, when the Russian society and the Russian nomenclatura, the political elite, has all the incentives to make a big U-turn, because there are headwinds associated with the old aggressive course, but there are benefits from warming up and removing some of the most aggressive elements. It always makes this U-turn. So any aggressive push in the Russian history in the past 100 years or even more always ends up with a thaw, because the costs of continuing the aggressive policies are too high. And again, there's no basis among the society for this perpetual aggressive policies, perpetual war, and so on. Now, what happens post-Putin? It's a difficult question. It's by all means, it's not going to be an easy transition. So Russia might be a mess for quite a long time. However, what I can say from my own personal experience, also supported with objective data, and I've been through most of Russia, I've been to 3/4 of the Russian regions. I literally shook hands of tens of thousands of Russians across the country, many of whom were not friendly to me and were quite hostile and against the West and the idea of liberal democracy and so on. But Russians have very strong democratic instincts. If you ask them what do they want, they would say rule of law, accountability of a government, ability to have a say on how the country is governed, ability to put emergency brakes on what the government is doing, free and fair elections, independent judiciary. This is, I mean, if you even listen to official Russian propaganda, they don't say we abolish all that and become absolute monarchy. No. Kremlin actually invests a lot of money and effort to maintain that facade, that we do have elections. Even the ruling United Russia Party holds primaries, very expensive. You might ask a question, why are they doing that? Because they want to maintain the facade that they still want to hear people's opinion and people count for something, you know. So this is not to say that majority of Russians want a Western-style liberal democracy by the book. I would dare say that many residents of the Western democracies also do not want it to be a liberal democracy by the book, you know. But the instinct is there. Majority of Russians do not want absolute monarchy and sort of submit themselves to the ruler. No. They want rule of law, independent courts, accountable government, free and fair competitive elections. We saw many cases of regional protests like Khabarovsk, Yekaterinburg, Bashkiria, Arkhangelsk, where people in the recent years essentially revolted against oppressive political monopoly of the ruling party. So the instincts are there, which is why we, the Russian Democrats, see the Russian population as a potential ally in our idea to build a future, normal, peaceful, democratic country that will respect sovereignty of its neighbors, internationally recognized borders, and will be inward-looking, focusing on building a decent living standards domestically on the 17 million square kilometers that Russia controls in its internationally recognized borders without attacking and occupying anyone, right? So there is a possibility, there is a response on the part of the society, so there is a light at the end of the tunnel. Of course, the tunnel is long, and it will be really very difficult because Russia never had a successful experience of good democratic governance. But again, I'm not fatalistic and deterministic at all. The part of the society which is chauvinistic, aggressive, imperialist is relatively thin. Majority wants normalcy. We have to exploit that, and I think there is a way forward in this regard. Sorry for lengthy answer.
No, I think this is an extremely important area also because the whole issue of frustration. Like, what about the people who are today sort of very good administrators, but part of the regime, such as Naibulina, the central bank director, or Mishustin, the prime minister? You know, these people who are keeping the things together on the one hand, but on the other hand are complicit in the atrocities that are taking place. How do you deal with, specifically that transition period And what are the messages to these people who maybe understand that they have to let go of the current regime?
Well, me and my colleagues, actually, a lot of different members of the Russian opposition in exile have been working on different post-Putin transition projects. They all line up basically in the same direction. I would simply refer to what my colleagues at the Free Russia Foundation is doing. You can basically access the Free Russia Foundation website and find a significant chapter of the website devoted to our transitional ideas. What we talk about is the need to use a multiple experience of various post-totalitarian countries in terms of transitional justice. We can use totally different examples from a post-1945 Germany to places like post-apartheid South Africa when they had a Truth and a Reconciliation Commission. As a matter of fact, the principles are very simple. We want everybody who was complicit in Putin's war crimes, even in an indirect manner, like helping Putin's authoritarian economy to survive and stay afloat, and through that enable Putin's war machine. We want all these people to publicly testify and admit that they were complicit in war crimes or enabling Putin's aggressive system and so on. Then once they honestly testify, the road might be open for many of them after they pay for whatever sins are associated with some specific persons to reintegrate in a post-war society. But first, open testimony, full admission of guilt, a responsibility that is being deserved, and then potentially the chance to reintegrate into normal democratic society. We really have a very significant amounts of experience of transitional justice in this various post-totalitarian society. We try to summarize all this in with colleagues in a very academic fashion. Please feel free to read it, but I think we won't have to build it from scratch because other countries have done it in the past in a very, very difficult situations, and they somehow managed to achieve progress, and we hope that we will be able to do the same.
Thank you. I'll just see if there are any questions from the audience. So you're welcome to write your questions in the chat box as part of this webinar. If you have any questions, I'll post them to Vladimir Milov. Otherwise, I am full of questions because I like to hear about what is you are speaking about the political opposition in exile at the moment, the way that you're working. How do you see, the way that we can actually support your work and in going forward?
Well, first, I have to say that the Western governments already do a lot to support Russian opposition in exile, and we are very thankful for that. I think also the issue here is that the West has been overwhelmed by the number of people who fled Russia because of extreme repressions and crackdown on domestic opposition, and later because of the war. So we're literally talking about no less than hundreds of thousands Russians leaving the country, and some of the estimates put these figures well above 1 million people or even more. We don't know the exact number. What we do know, I know personally because I'm one of the frequent visitors of these migration departments myself, because I need documents to stay. I'm currently based in Lithuania, but I also see that many other people have the same problems. We see that, the Western migration authorities are overwhelmed with the flood of Russians that are trying to get asylum, residence, and so on. This is actually multiplied by extreme numbers of Ukrainian refugees who are fleeing Russian aggression, obviously, but also refugees from other countries like Belarus. An example, in the past 4 years following the stolen presidential elections by Lukashenko and subsequent extreme repressions, hundreds of thousands of Belarusians have fled the country. So this is one more addition to the pressure on the West. We would advise Western governments, and we're really ready to help in that, to better calibrate the system because many people have really good reasons to fear repression at home. They have been involved in anti-Putin, anti-war, pro-democracy protests and movement. Some of them really do not get the treatment they deserve by the Western migration authorities on humanitarian grounds. We often see that it happens simply because of a lack of processing capacity. We're really ready to offer our help here. So that is a very, very important issue. But generally, I think what is important is that Western societies, Western policymakers actually keep noticing the important job that we are doing, because Russian exiles provide really good policy advice to Western governments on sanctions, on how Russian system works, economy works, to better calibrate it, to make them more efficient. We are engaged in a really very, very significant large-scale broadcasting effort onto the Russian territory through social media, truly influencing the domestic public opinion in my home country. The extent is much bigger than, say, the influence of Western radio stations that broadcasted onto the territory of the USSR during the Cold War times. We now have tens of millions of people of audience inside Russia. That is bigger than what the Western radio had in the Cold War by order of magnitude. So that is an effort that is not costly, but is worth supporting, and it will pay back in the future. And again, as I said earlier, it's very important not to consider majority of Russian population as enemies. These are people who are simply being fooled and poisoned by propaganda. 20 years ago, they were more normal. 70% of Russians had positive opinion of the United States. More than half of Russians had negative opinion about Stalin. And 35% of Russians wanted to apply for NATO membership. That was, I remember, because I used to work at government at the moment, and that was at the time when Vladimir Putin visited Rome in May 2002 and signed the Rome Declaration with NATO alliance about partnership, cooperation, and so on. That was overwhelmingly supported, and that was just 20 plus years ago. So what we see now is more a result of a poisonous propaganda. We need to counter that. And I would say that Russian opposition in exile is doing that relatively effectively. So first, I want the Western society and policymakers to pay attention to what we're doing, because really I think this often goes underneath the radar, but we are engaged in some very important activities that might help the free world achieve its goals in resisting aggressive Putinism.
Thank you. I have a question from Peter Brückner, and he's asking to you personally, has your personal security been threatened by the regime?
Jeg kan ikke finde en app med navnet Brasanhold Security. Du kan søge efter den i App Store.
Definitely, and there's been an unfortunate accident here in Vilnius in March, where one of my closest colleagues, Leonid Volkov, chief of staff of Alexei Navalny's Anti-Corruption Foundation, he's been assaulted and badly wounded with a hammer right here, after which we really had some consultations with Lithuanian law enforcement. I was identified as one of the top potential next targets, so we have to take some precautionary security measures. There's been many other examples of other exiled Russians being threatened or assaulted and so on. But, this is not something that might force us to give up what we're doing, because we have been living under that risk for decades. And I have lost some of my closest allies, and my friend and co-author Boris Nemtsov was murdered by Putin nearly 10 years ago. My very close friend Vladimir Milov, whom I was really happy to see last weekend in Prague at GlobeSec conference. That was his public appearance at the conference after the prisoner swap. And I was happy to see and hug him and say hello. He was poisoned twice and sentenced to 25 years in Putin's prison. My friend Alexei Navalny was murdered in prison. So, all this happens at, very close range, and I'm also at risk. But if Putin and his thugs only think that this threat might stop us from actually doing what we're doing, no way. we have been living with this threat for years and years now, and we are clearly committed to continue the fight against Putin. We see that the Russian population, significant part of it is on our side, so it's no time to get scared and give up.
Thank you. Now I have a question from Christian Gottlieb. How do you see the role of the Russian Orthodox Church, specifically the current patriarch, who has been very vocal in his support for the Russian war, even to the extent of labeling it a holy war? Will the church sink with Putin's regime if that happens?
Well, holy war, I don't know. There's a lot of this absolutely unnecessary ideological or pseudo-ideological foam that is, you know, running around what is happening. What we do see, if you scratch that surface, what we do see that these ideological constructs essentially do not stick with the, you know, majority, and Putin is constantly, and his entourage and supporters of this war of aggression, they constantly try to invent all these new justifications, new ideological ideas that might justify what Putin is doing. But I mean, neither Russian society nor anyone else is really buying this thing in big numbers. Again, even in Russia, we can see that, again, this layer of people who actively, consciously support the war of aggression is pretty much limited. I would refer to, that's basically the same number has been surfacing for years and years. Valery Fedorov, the head of the COM opinion polling center, a year ago said in an interview that there's no more than 10-15% of the aggressive imperialist part of the Russian population, as he called it, party of war. I have to say that about 10 years ago, before the Russian annexation of Crimea and the first beginning of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, taking over Ukrainian territory, there was a series of opinion polling data which suggested that no more than 15-20% of the Russian population actually wants to take part of the Ukrainian territory. By that time, about 2/3 of the Russians wanted to respect Ukrainian territorial sovereignty in 1991 internationally respected borders. So again, all these ideologies, the holiness, this is stuff that is invented. Most people, even in today's Russia, they still want to go back to some form of normalcy.
And Vladimir Milov, thank you so much for making us so much wiser and clever. And I hope that you will maybe one day participate in another time, maybe in a more joyful time. But thank you so much, and good luck in your work.
Thank you. I'll be most happy to join you again. And that was very useful. And thank everybody for participating.